A little bit of housekeeping as we get started this morning. I'm not going to be around for the next couple of weeks. And so we will miss a couple of weeks. I'll try to do better about getting out an email and some other stuff. Going forward, I didn't do very well with that this week. Lots of things happening in my humble little life. Getting an opportunity to teach for a group down in the Charlotte area. It's called the Institute for Theology and Mission. And they have a need for a couple, 3 weeks. So starting tonight and next Tuesday night and Friday and Saturday, the 3rd and 4th, I think, of May. I'll be teaching for them.
Cool.
It's an interesting time. They're the class I'm teaching is doing an Old Testament survey, which is a horrible thing to ask somebody to do. You got to read the whole Old Testament in one semester and try to understand what it's about. The class was worthless when I took it as a student.
I remember.
And it's just too much. You can't do that. So I've been trying to prepare for, we're going to talk about Jeremiah and Lamentations tonight. We have 2 hours. And then next Tuesday night, it's Ezekiel, 2 hours in Ezekiel, and then the Thursday or the Friday night and Saturday session that will be in person. I'll be down in Charlotte to do that. We'll be teaching the Daniel and the 12. So
Wow.
Can you imagine teaching Daniel and the 12 in one session? That's a little crazy. It's been fun. One of the big moments I had as I've been preparing for this, been thinking about Ezekiel especially. Ezekiel addresses the same 2 problems that the middle part of the book of Isaiah addresses. As the people were put into exile, and Deacon and I talk about this all the time, as they marched toward Babylon, they were looking over their shoulder, watching that column of smoke rise in Jerusalem. And so they had 2 problems, didn't they? They were supposed to be in that place in Jerusalem, that's the land, and they're supposed to have a righteous ruler ruling over a righteous people. And so if you're on your way to Babylon because of your sin, it's a little hard to imagine how you're going to be a righteous people ruled by a righteous king. So they got 2 problems. They're not in the land anymore, and their sin is a problem, preventing what's supposed to happen there. And so that's the same 2 problems that Ezekiel addresses. Ezekiel, as he talks about it, he's in Babylon already. He was part of the first group to get deported. And so he's sitting in Babylon, and he's waiting for the watchman to come and tell him that Jerusalem has fallen, which happens in the book of Ezekiel. And so it's almost it almost raises the hair on the back of my neck to think that these people are literally being put out of their land. Thousands and thousands of them were killed. The remainder ended up in a forced march to Babylon. And God is so concerned about them that he's had Isaiah talk about it. He's had Ezekiel talk about it, and Jeremiah also. Jeremiah, if you think about those 3 prophets, Isaiah talked about it before it happened. Jeremiah talked about it from the perspective of being in Jerusalem and watching what's coming. And then Ezekiel talks about it from the perspective of being in Babylon and looking at what's happening. So God's, it is as if Isaiah chapter 40 verse 1 is meant for all 3 of those prophets. And the words of that verse are comfort, comfort ye my people.
The interesting thing there is the situation that you mentioned 3 times.
Yeah,
Is perfect hopelessness. Perfect hopelessness. And then the answer is comfort.
Yeah.
And you got those in contrast.
yep. So there's quite a lot going on, and it's going to be probably 3 weeks where we meet again. So hang in there, guys. Keep watching the news. Watch for 5 minutes, then turn it off. And then watch for 5 minutes tomorrow and turn it off.
Yeah, which channel are you gonna trust, right?
Yeah, 0. So I'm going to pick up here in verse 9 of chapter 2. And this is Jesus talking to the church at Smyrna. Well, wait, I've already talked about verse 9. Don't fear what you're about to suffer is verse 10. The devil's about to cast some of you into prison, and you will have tribulation. What did Jesus say we would have? John 16:33. In this world you will have trouble, tribulation. But live big, live lion-hearted, live victoriously, because I have overcome this world. John 16:33. So what are we supposed to do? Live victoriously. That's what. And we talked a little bit about what our victories look like. So that's an interesting thought, isn't it? What our victories don't look like victories sometimes. But Ben's talking about the faith of his children and the faith of those people in that generation. So our faith has been passed on to that generation. That's a victory, guys. There's a whole slew of that generation out there that doesn't know that the Bible even exists, but there are still, and there always will be, unless Jesus was wrong when he said, not even the gates of hell can prevail against my church. So we're going to be there, and it's our business to be what we're supposed to be. And so let's live lion-hearted in the midst of all of it. The rockets are going to fly. Israel's going to, I suspect Israel's going to strike back at Iran. We may be in the midst of war unlike anything we've seen since the middle of the last century. And yet Jesus says, hang in there, hang on, keep the faith. So verse 10, do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison, so that you will be tested, and you will have tribulation for 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. They're encouraged not to fear. I think the Bible says, fear not, or don't be afraid. I think it's over 600 times that the Lord speaks to his people, whether it's Israel or the church, and says, fear not, do not fear, don't be afraid. When Abraham fell on his face before the 3 visitors, and then he knew that they were the Lord, the first words out of their mouth was, do not fear. We're not to fear. My fear is the fear of the Lord. That's the only thing I'm to fear. And what that means is to understand that he is the ultimate authority, understand that nobody else is going to replace him, understand that he is in fact in charge, he is in fact on the throne, he does in fact know what's going on, and yes, he's here with us all day, every day. So they're encouraged not to fear. economic and political persecution, even when it takes the harsher forms of imprisonment and capital punishment. All those things sound familiar somehow. Jeez. Christ tells them to brace for even more severe persecution. You think that's a word for us for these days? The reason they should not fear is that their lives and destiny are in the hands of the eternal Lord of history, who has already experienced persecution, even to death, and has overcome it through his resurrection. There's been no greater victory in all of history, nor will there ever be a greater victory than Jesus' resurrection from the dead. There's nothing that even competes with that, guys. There is no greater victory. Therefore, the true saints don't have to fear the devil's attempt to bring compromise into the church. Instead, the Lord will use the devil's efforts for the purpose that you may be tested of strengthening his people through these tests. We are to be strengthened by the things we're undergoing. We are to be faithful in them, and as we are faithful, we will be strengthened. We will be strengthened as individuals. We will be strengthened as a church. The Lord will not abandon any of us or our church. That will not happen. Does that mean I won't die? Nope, I'm going to die. Does that mean everything's going to be easy? It does not mean things are going to be easy. We're going to have to follow in Jesus' footsteps. How hard do you suppose it was after they'd torn all the shreds of flesh off his back? How hard do you suppose it was to carry the cross? How hard do you suppose it was to make that walk from the temple to the outside of the city, and then get nailed to a cross? And once they nailed him, guys, they stood that cross up. If you haven't thought about it, imagine what it was like when that cross fell into the hole that was dug for it.
That they should not fear with their lives and destiny. And those two things there are important. You should not be afraid of death because there is a destiny. But the balance between these two, you just can't say, oh, well, then the life doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
I need to focus on destiny. That's wrong.
Yeah.
And then if you sit back and say, oh, I've got to live this right and forget the destiny, that's wrong.
Yeah.
So you got to have a balance between the two of them.
Yeah.
And it's interesting.
It is a most humbling thing to address the most existential question that there is. And that is, how am I here?
Yeah.
What am I here for? Why is there a Bob Cole? And I need an answer to that question, and I couldn't answer it until I discovered Jesus. Our purpose is not to be the best Bob Cole I can be. My purpose is to trust the Lord and live my life in a way that calls the people around me to trust the Lord. My existential question doesn't really get answered until the day I stand before Jesus and hear, well done, good and faithful servant. Well, there's nothing good and faithful about Bob Cole. That ain't what he's going to be talking about. What he's going to be talking about is that I made the decision to trust Jesus, and in him I have been a good and faithful servant. In his eyes, in the Lord's eyes, I have been a good and faithful servant. I sure am looking forward to that, guys, more and more as I hold the newspaper and hold the Bible. Saints needn't fear the devil's attempt to bring compromise into the church. Instead, the Lord will use the devil's efforts for the purpose that we might be tested. The words "so that" express God's overruling purpose. The devil's doing what he's doing, he thinks, autonomously. But is God still on the throne? Yes. Can God use what the devil does, even what the devil does, for his purposes? The answer is yes, he does. Yes, he does all day, every day. Yes, he does, because we are being tested, being strengthened. In that, we are witnesses to the world around us. The church is not going to disappear. The church is not going anywhere. Even the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So, even the work of the devil is used by God to further his plan. So, just as the devil's plans for the cross were used by God to bring salvation to the world, so the suffering of the church at Smyrna would result in blessing and ultimate deliverance for them. And we know that this message is for the Big C church. It's true of us as well, that God's going to use what's happening for his purposes. That calls for faith from us, doesn't it?
You know, something I was reading about this past week in Ukraine. Russia destroyed 342 of the churches. They bombed that many buildings. But you still have the folks that make up each one of those churches. So if we think we've got it here today, and hey, just like today, you can imagine coming up here and hey, all the work that's been put into the new gymnasium or center next door, and all of a sudden that's level, and people come out and they're looking for some type of way to get together and meet, and all of a sudden, bang, that facility's gone. I mean, all of a sudden, it's got to wake the crowd up quite a bit in all those different cities where that transpired.
Yep.
That's got to be tough.
Yep. So, in this letter, Jesus describes himself as the first and the last. And this is the Smyrna letter, so we're in the second church. And remember, the second and the sixth churches are those that are were not chastised. Jesus coming for those churches was to encourage them and strengthen them, and not to warn them or chastise them. So describing himself in this letter as the first and the last, that's an allusion to God's self-description in Isaiah and in a lot of other places as well. Isaiah 41:4, who has performed and accomplished it, calling forth the generations from the beginning. I, the Lord, am the first, and with the last, I am he. That's the answer to the who has accomplished it question. 44:6, thus says the Lord, the King of Israel and his Redeemer, the Lord of hosts, I am the first and I am the last, and there is no God besides me. I don't have to be fearful. I don't have to worry. I don't have to have trouble. Am I aware of that all day, every day? I get scared pretty much every day, guys. But the truth is that the Lord is still on his throne, and my fear is unfounded. The only fear of mine that's real is the fear of the Lord. I must trust that there is no higher authority. I must trust that there is no one that can snatch me out of his hand. Cannot happen. That's encouraging.
I think there's one point in comfort in this, is if you got to stop and you put it in the back of your mind and you say, before any of this stuff comes to me, it's passed through his hands. So if he's put the seal of approval to let this function go on, is it tough? Yeah. I think what we gotta do is slow down and think about, what am I supposed to learn out of this?
Or what does my victory look like in this? Yeah, yeah, you're exactly right, Fred.
Well, I don't know if you can have a victory before you learn something, right? Because the Lord's wanting to bless you if you catch on to it. Yeah, right, yeah, that's the outcome you down the road, yeah.
In the context of Isaiah 41:4 and 44:6, a couple of those verses we just read, God commands the Israelites, do not fear, just as he now commands the saints at Smyrna. The implication is that the saints at Smyrna are now among the true Israel, because God addresses them in the same way he addressed the faithful Israel in Isaiah's day. Don't miss what's being said there, guys. In the Old Testament, before Jesus came, God said to Israel, I am the first and I am the last. That's never going to change. God doesn't change. His truth doesn't change. And now he's speaking to the church at Smyrna and saying, I am the first and I am the last. When God speaks to both the same thing to Israel and to the church, it means that the church is now part of, at least part of, Israel. It means that the church is receiving from God the same thing that Israel received from God, and that is his personal testimony that I am God. I am the first and the last. You and I need to understand that in the same way that Moses saw that burning bush and said, I better go over there and see what this is about. So you and I are called, aren't we called by what we see happening around us to look around and say, you know, this is not normal. This is not right. I have to go see what's going on. And in that going to see, in that standing as a witness to it, in that, Paul's going to tell us in Ephesians, stand. And when he says that, it's a military term. In the Marine Corps, they taught us hand-to-hand combat. They taught us how to fight with a bayonet. The first thing you do in that bayonet fight is assume a stance so that you cannot be knocked down. Stand is what that means. It's coming, your enemy's coming, and he's coming fast and hard. And the Marine Corps will tell you in 4 seconds, one or the other of you is going to be gone. You have 4 seconds to win this. You better get your feet planted or it's over. Stand is what Paul's telling us. That's a hard call. So the implication is that the saints of Smyrna are now among the true Israel. He addressed Israel the same way that he's talking to Smyrna. He addressed Israel in the same way in Isaiah's day. Because Jesus is the ultimate commander of history, he's able to state that the coming tribulation will be brief. Oh, it's just as Fred just said, it's got to come through his hands. Jesus is the one who can say, stop to the tribulation. He's the one that can say, enough, we're done. Satan can't go beyond what Jesus says. He can't, he just can't. There is one Lord and ruler of the universe. There's not two, just one. So when Jesus says it's over, it's over.
Bob, do you understand that word? Explain the word brief to me in that context. Because now here's the question that comes up to me. Is it in my time and conception of that, or is it in Jesus's time, which we don't know how long a day is in heaven when he says brief?
Yeah, good question. My time of tribulation is going to be brief one way or the other because it's only going to be in this life. My life is 70, or if I'm really lucky, 80. In that is brevity. Ben, you're the only one in the room that isn't as old as me. Take that.
Jesus, did you hear that?
It's, the one thing I can say to everyone younger than me is savor it, enjoy it, because it's a blink of an eye. It is indeed brief. I have 70 some years worth of memories, but it was like that. I can remember just 10 years ago, my wife and I describing what it would take for us to be able to retire.
And here you are.
Lots happened since then, guys, a lot. But it happens like that. My dad told me, and for his end days, he said, if I'd have known how long I was gonna be retired, I'd have done this differently. He was retired nearly 25 years. That's a long time. 25 years is a significant chunk of your life.
It's probably a third of of what's projected for an annual, well, it's a time for a human being, right? Or at least guys. The
Yeah.
gals get a bump on 10 years, but yeah.
So Daniel and his friends were tested for 10 days. Remember Daniel? This is an allusion to Daniel's testing for 10 days. Remember, they were told, all the captives were told, you're going to eat from the king's table every day. And Daniel recognized that that was idolatry, and he didn't want to do it. And so he proposed a way to get around it. And God honored his proposition. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his friends looked better, looked healthier than those that were eating from the king's table. How many of you think that eating vegetables over a 10-day period is going to make you look better than the guys who eat vegetables and Big Macs for 10 days? 10 days isn't going to change anybody's appearance much, is it? And yet, when they looked at Daniel and his friends after those 10 days, it was apparent to the lookers that, you know what, Daniel's way is better. Who did that?
And in that situation,
Come along.
I was gonna say, I'm blown away that, in that situation where they should be like angry with God. I mean, they're taken away from everything they know, but they still like hunkered down and chose to
Yeah,
glorify him in that situation. That blows me away.
yeah. Later on in the book of Daniel, he's going to be at a feast, and in the midst of that feast, the king at that time is going to call for his servants to go get all those things that we brought out of the temple in Jerusalem and bring them here. We're gonna drink our wine out of the cup that they say is God's cup. And Daniel and his friends had already refused to be a part of that. But in that, I think, is something that's necessary for us to understand. Daniel and his friends looked at what was going on there and said, that's a line I can't cross, because those vessels, having been made by the Spirit of the Lord within the maker of those vessels were consecrated, they were set aside, they were holy, and Daniel could not defile them. So what is it in my life that is not to be defiled? What is it that can't be taken away from me, that I can't allow to be taken away from me? It's happened all through history, hasn't it? That somebody says, you must deny Jesus Christ or today you die. Isn't that the ultimate thing that's holy? Isn't that the line we cannot cross?
I don't think you can cross the line of commitment.
Well, it's exactly what we're
Because
talking
you do
about.
all that you stop looking. just like all the things that went on in the temple and all the things that were holy at that point and all the things you've done in life, you've made a commitment to see Christ. And you don't want to deviate from that road.
Exactly. The saints at Smyrna would have understood the significance of Christ, comparing them with Daniel and his friends. They knew what their Old Testament said. They'd all grown up Jews, probably. Like saints throughout the church age, the Christians at Smyrna would periodically undergo brief but severe periods of trial. It's the Greek word thalipsis. Really hard to spell in the English language because we don't have the letter theta in our language, in our alphabet. These trials and tribulations refer to the emerging birth pangs of last days events. We've talked a lot about last days. I was in a bookstore yesterday, a Christian bookstore, and there's that title again. Are we in the last days? We are in the last days, guys. The last days are the time between Jesus' resurrection and his final coming. Those are the last days. Those are the last days. The last days aren't somewhere in our future. These days, our days, the days that you and I are living out, these days are the last days. Not some other days yet in our future. These days are the last days. Yes, we're living in the last days. Church history up to our day confirms that Christians have always in the church age suffered for their faith. Isn't that true? Are Christians in India suffering for their faith? Are Christians in Africa suffering for their faith? Are Christians in China suffering for their faith? Are Christians in the United States of America going to suffer for their faith? Seems to me like that's where we're headed.
I think you can see it's already commenced. Like Easter at the White House, if that wasn't a piece of work. I mean, that should have hit the whole nation right between the eyes.
Yeah.
How far this garbage has gotten.
Christians who are faithful in the face of this testing will receive the crown of life. Jesus says, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death.
You know, there's a point in here, Bob, that I think some folks wrestle with. And I've been thinking about it since the minute you meant from Christ moving forward or up through today is the end times. But there's so many folks that are so-called Christians that argue that this has got to happen first before Christ returns, or this got, and they get snagged and hung up on this stuff. There's nothing that's stopping them from showing up today.
It is not for you and I to know.
Well, Jesus didn't know at the time, right? Because the Father hadn't told him yet.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to keep in mind in Rebecca, God tells Rebecca to watch, it will come, it will not tarry. But that's God talking about tarry. That's not our tarry.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That could be over like that. If he doesn't tear it.
Maybe a generation or 5 or 6, but
I'm going to do a terrible thing to you, Deke. Read the first 3 verses of Ezekiel before the end of today.
Okay. All right, I will.
Ezekiel's called to be a watchman. So, promise the crown of life and victory over the second death. That's the ultimate victory, isn't it? Jesus took away the second death. I'm not going to die that second death. I'm not. I just am not. And so, do I need to be afraid? No. Am I gonna remember that all day, every day? I still struggle with it. The apparent defeat in death under the authority of the Roman crown resulted in their victory of life and their inheritance of a heavenly crown. Their apparent defeat was indeed a victory. When and if somebody puts me to death for my faith, that will be a victory. I will, in that day, if I'm faithful, I will in that day enjoy the victory of life. And that's the ultimate victory. That's the victory that has been won for us already at the cross. My victory in this life may or may not look like a victory to the world around me. But when I stand before Jesus and he says, well done, good and faithful servant, my friends, I will be dancing and singing and jumping up and down, shouting, because I have won everything. Everything.
I think that's gonna be quite the sight, watching Bob dance. I'm just teasing.
Now, Fred, over this last couple of days, Lou and I got to sit with a guy from China and his friend, and we got to see a video of his friend being baptized. As he stood in the baptismal, this guy stood there with his t-shirt on and his shorts because he was going to get wet, and he pronounced to a whole great large church what a wonderful thing this was. And then our friend, Lou's friend, got him down, baptized him. And when that guy came up out of the water, he came up out shouting and screaming in joy. He ripped the shirt off himself and swung it around over his head. And he was dancing and prancing, and he was full of joy. I mean, you have to see that. You really have to see it. It's unbelievable. Yeah, have him send us that video, because I wish the whole church could see that.
Yeah, you know, when we do it here in America, it's pretty solid. When you stop to think about it, you don't hear, you know, sometimes you see a smile on somebody, you know, I just wonder what people think about when they come up. Because sometimes, you know, I look at the ladies, some of the ladies come up and said, oh, stand in front of this crowd with all this wet hair. You know, or so, you know, I said, you concentrating on what you went under for. But yeah.
So the crown of life reveals their participation in Christ's victorious rule. As we are in him, we receive a crown because he has a crown. We receive, because Romans 6 says, if we were identified with him in his crucifixion, even so, God will also bring us with him in his resurrection. And in his resurrection, we live with Christ. We enjoy all that he enjoys. We reign with him in some sense because of the victory that we have over death. Though that middle part, those first, I think it's 13 verses of Romans 6, describe in a really few words what happens to us when we become a Christian. We are identified with him in his crucifixion, and we are raised to new life by God because we identified with him in his crucifixion. So we will be identified with him in his resurrection. God's already done that. He who overcomes refers to those whose apparent death results in their eternal life in Christ, and a crown symbolizing their reign with Christ. I will certainly be silent as I sit there with Jesus and watch him reign.
Mhm.
I am not going to participate in telling him how it ought to go. But as I am there with him and in him, I will in fact participate in that reign. I should already be doing that. I should be showing victories day after day as I walk through this life. So that's the letter to Smyrna. The second letter, church is doing really good. So let's think about it a little bit. Limits of obedience to civil government.
Mhm.
Is this a relevant question? I gotta confess, Ben, I was watching you carefully walk through COVID. Because you were not happy about some of the things your government was asking you to do. And I was well aware that Ben was not happy about some of those things. And we all enjoyed some freedom there to think about what was right and what wasn't right. As time goes by, after the COVID thing, I'm more and more inclined to say, you know what, Ben, I'm with you. My government was not concerned about me during COVID. They were concerned about how they were going to get done what they wanted to get done. And it's the same government that I'm looking at today, sadly. So how do we talk about obedience to civil government? How do we pass our thinking along to the next generation about our thinking? And I'd love for you to answer that, Ben.
Well, and for me, the hard part is, and I think within civil government, within church leadership, just within relationships in general, it's really easy because I think we frame most everything as like, it's easier when it's clear cut evil versus clear cut good. You know what I'm saying? You can like draw up the lines and like it's easy to say like this is worthy of battle. The harder thing for me, and this is that whole thing, how to navigate that. And so it is, and so for me, still, prayer for wisdom and all that is to understand or know best case how to live and do this. I hope this makes sense. Is when not everything is clear cut. You know what I'm saying? And you're trying to like work through these disagreements, agreements, whatever, with people that you love, people that seem to believe the same things. And it's like, so that was very difficult to me. So so I guess my answer is like I don't necessarily have an answer other than like constantly going to the Holy Spirit, and again that's also a thing because you got to nurture the Holy Spirit as well as try to listen and so I guess I'm saying like I don't know, Bob, I'm still processing that, working that like every day.
Yeah, it is. I would have bet that's what Ben was going to say. It really is hard. Romans 13, Paul tells us, obey the authorities that God has placed over you. That's pretty clear cut. But then also Daniel refused to obey the authorities placed over him. Did he quit praying when he was told not to go to his house and pray? He threw the windows open, and my suspicion is he put his elbows up on the windowsill and prayed loud so they could hear him praying.
When even in Acts 16, that I was telling everybody to read, they came and like they found out they had beaten Paul and that he was a Roman citizen, and so they quietly like, you need to go on your way. And he's like, no. He's like, no, you come down here. Y'all did this thing, and he was calling them out. So he didn't just. So it's keep going at me and interrupt. These thoughts are like
that's perfectly legitimate.
I can give you an example of that.
Okay.
We had a Bible study down there in a church at Myrtle Beach, and of course, one of the pastors comes in and says, Fred, you and the guys can't meet here anymore because we gotta close the doors. So I asked the Lord, basically, what can we do if we can't meet here? Well, next thing is Friendly's opens up the door. No cost for the big dining room area. In the back, we have our own separate area. They're serving us breakfast. We moved down there and we're growing more. So I said, there seems like alternatives. Our church down there, for example, at the beach, the pastors are probably even a little bit younger than Ben. And he says, we can't go in the church, but we can meet in the parking lot. And we met in the parking lot. And they had a little stage built for the, sound system and whatever. And there isn't much we missed. So, and then I guess the next thing is the question you gotta ask, well, if anything develops out of that, who's gonna enforce it? The police don't care. That's not in their, technically in their jurisdiction. Who's gonna come down and say something? So I'm sure Satan squashed a lot of people and a lot of preaching for a lot of times. And if you look over it and look at the numbers, Satan got his way when it was over, because from what I've heard, the numbers are down in church attendance after COVID. So did Satan maybe win that battle? I don't know. If you look at the numbers, you'd say, hey, but I'm still trying to figure out where Jesus is taking it from here. If when the numbers are hopefully going to return, and maybe they're not, or maybe that crowd wasn't meant to be in his church. I don't know.
Yeah, this is it's a hard thing. Did COVID serve to call some people out of the church that maybe were only there because it was convenient? I don't know the answer to that question. I suspect it's true. The church is going to get through persecution. The church always gets purified.
Right.
And so that's been historically true. I think it will be true in the US as well.
If you look at China, I mean, it's been persecuted for so long now. You don't have big churches, but you got a lot more Christians. You got a lot of people meeting in their homes, and
Yeah.
when they get baptized, they jump up and swirl their shirts.
The three situations of faith in the Bible that I find fascinating and troubling. One is John, in John, Thomas. Christ is in Jerusalem. The Pharisees start throwing rocks at him. They get him out, get down to where John the Baptist is, because they can outnumber him and so forth. And while they're down there, he finds out that Lazarus is sick, and he says, well, we'll be going back up there. And Thomas says, that's ridiculous to go back up there. Bethany is only 25-minute walk from the Kidron Valley, right outside the gate. And they're going to be there. There's no sense in going back in. And even in John, he reports that he says, this is silly. We're all going to be killed if we go back up there.
Yeah.
Except the statement of the thing about his faith is the fact he goes. And he still thinks it's dumb, but he goes. And the point is that he's right in his faith in doing that. The second problem of faith, and I can understand that, the second problem of his faith is the young father whose son is an epileptic. And he goes to the disciples to cure it. They cannot cure this, okay? And then I think one of the greatest pleas in the world is Christ tells him, says, this takes a special thing. And his situation, I have faith, help, I believe, help my unbelief. Now that is a cry, it's a desperate cry. And the third person is the woman with the blood issue.
Oh, yeah.
And she goes and touches. Christ doesn't even know that he's healing.
Yeah.
Now that is a unbelievable special thing. Those three statements of faith I find curious and mystifying. I understand Thomas. I have a little mystery problem with the Father, but he is just amazing to me.
Howdy, Pastor.
How y'all doing?
Okay, y'all ready to go?
What's the difference in those states?
Well, I got a story, but nevertheless,
Oh, it's a good one. Come on over.
that's
Sam.
not a good one. I just. I overslept.
It's truthful. But back there,
So-
it wasn't a situation though with that woman when that happened. She touched
She touched
the
him.
robe of
She
Christ.
said, if
Now,
I can just
Christ
touch
wanted to know
his-
where the power had come out of him, yeah.
And those three statements of the three indications of faith, I think, are mystifying to me. Not the first one, I think. So
But-
explain them to me, Bob.
Back to your original question, I don't mean to interrupt, another hard thing, well, finish explaining to Deke. I wanna hear your answer on this one,
Oh,
too.
I don't have answers.
Sorry, my
for
brain
you.
is still on the question that you asked me, so I'm still.
Yeah. Yeah, our time is about to be up. Our faith is a moment by moment, situation by situation. Kind of faith. And Paul works hard in his letters to help people understand this isn't a synagogue day faith that I'm calling you to. This is an all day, everyday faith. This is a faith that makes decisions this morning based on what my faith is. And it's a faith that says, I'm going to decide tomorrow based on what my faith is. Ben was, in spite of what was going on in his heart and the struggle that he was feeling, Ben was faithful to obey the civil authorities, as far as I could see. And he was faithful also to be thinking about what his faith wanted him to do. That's what we all must do in all of those circumstances, isn't it? We're all called to meet the day with faith. That's gonna get harder, I think, as the days wear on. But it's also going to be more biblical. We're going to be able to look at the Bible and say, you know what? Stephen was faithful. Paul was faithful. The disciples, after Jesus was crucified, those 11 of those 12 went out and died for their faith. You don't do that if there isn't some substance there. And that's what we're being called to, is that substance. We're called to see the army of God encircled around us and protecting us. We're called to live as though I'm standing behind Jesus in this battle, and who's going to get me through him? Only people that can get me through him is the ones he lets through. And they're not going to get me to the second death. All I can do is put this body to death. Is that easy? That ain't easy. Is it what we're called to? Is there victory in it? When I or anybody is faithful in spite of the threat, in spite of the execution of that threat. When we're faithful, no matter what the outcome in this world, that's a victory. That's the gates of hell trying to overcome Christ's church and failing, isn't it? Satan wants me to say, that Christianity stuff, no, not for me. I'm not a Christian, I want to live. That's what Satan wants. My victory is saying, my Lord is my Lord, and you can only hurt me to a certain place, no more. And so I trust my Lord. It's no small thing when the enemy's running at you with his bayonet fixed. And Paul says, stand. Get your feet planted. As the Marine Corps said, you got 4 seconds. Stand. That's not a long time, is it? 4 seconds? It's an eternity, guys. If you've ever been in a
You got a weapon looking at you or a bayonet looking at you, it's.
Get your feet squared away and be able to stand the onslaught.
yeah. Yeah. Do we love him? That's the question, isn't it? All right. So there's a lot we talked about this morning. How do we go out now? How do we take what we heard this morning and make it part of our lives? That's what we're supposed to do, right? This is the word of God. Big takeaway has to be he can be trusted. He can be trusted. Daniel refused to change his prayer life, and he ended up in the lion's den. Daniel's friends refused to bow down, and they ended up in the furnace. And one of the most striking things in the whole book of Daniel is when those 3 friends looked at the king and said, my God is able to rescue me even out of your stinking furnace. But whether he rescues me or not, whether he rescues me or not, he is my Lord. I will not deny him. That's a victory. That statement is a victory. And God honored that victory with another one, didn't he? It didn't even smell like smoke when they came out. You gotta be kidding me.
Don't you know that was a wake up call for the king to look in there and say, hey, these guys have more fun in there in the fire than they are out here with me.
That was true.
Yeah.
Do the fires come? Do the lions come? Is it going to be harder for us as days go by? Probably yes. I think it seems that way to me. I'm trying to rekindle in myself the kind of faith, the first love kind of faith that does know that there is more